What's up everyone, it's Bigfoot here. Today I'm going to talk about the most popular and perhaps most talked about section of the Appalachian Trail, the White Mountains. I'm going to cover the strenuous terrain that you can expect out there, the challenging ascents and descents. We're going to talk about the dangers of the Whites and the huts and how they work. Basically, we're going to talk about everything that you need to know before you hike the Appalachian Trail's White Mountains. To start off with, the section of trail that I'm referring to as the Whites is going to start at Mount Moosilauke, which is about mile marker 1,791 and some change, all the way to Pinkham Notch, and the remaining 21 miles to US 2, which is just on the northern side of Gorham, New Hampshire. I mentioned that the White Mountains is the most popular area of the trail. Believe it or not, there are more visitors that come to the White Mountain National Forest annually than all of Yosemite and all of Yellowstone combined. Think about that for a second. This area and section of the trail is very, very popular. Now, it's maintained by the Appalachian Mountain Club, or better known as AMC, which was founded back in 1876. Well, let's get started about the terrain. I hiked the whole Appalachian Trail, and the terrain that you're going to experience in the White Mountains is unlike anything else that you'll see on the rest of the Appalachian Trail. It is rugged, it is strenuous, it's very rocky, very rooty. To give you an idea, you probably have heard a lot and seen a lot about the rocks of Pennsylvania. The heaviest concentrated area of rocks in Pennsylvania would be very mild of anything that you see in the White Mountains, just to give you a clue. Now, during the course of this 100-mile section, you are going to come in contact with many strenuous climbs. Now, the first I mentioned coming up Mount Moosilauke. When you look at an elevation profile on AWOL's guide, you notice right away Mount Moosilauke, and it's got this humongous climb that starts at an elevation of about 1,300 feet all the way up to 4,800 feet. Now, at first glance, that stands out because of just how many feet of elevation that you're climbing. Now, I will tell you, after actually climbing Moosilauke, it was a lot easier of a climb than some climbs that I actually experienced in the southern Appalachians, most notably like Three Ridges. Going northbound, you don't really have to worry too much about climbing Mount Moosilauke. It's the descent that kills you. Going southbound, obviously, you're going to be climbing up that part. Now, when you're descending down Mount Moosilauke, you're going to hit a section of trail. It's about 1.5 miles long, and you're going to lose almost 2,000 feet of elevation. This is one of the more steep descents that you actually see on the Appalachian Trail. Luckily, there are some parts that the maintainers of that section of trail, which actually isn't the AMC actually doesn't pick up maintaining this section of trail until just after that descent of Mount Moosilauke. They have installed steps on the rock face to make it manageable and safer anyway, for you to descend down this section of the trail. Now, once you get past Mount Moosilauke, you're going to hit a 7-mile section of trail between Kingsman Notch and Eliza Brook Shelter. I remember this section of the trail very vividly. In my opinion, this was the most under-maintained area of the entire Appalachian Trail. Now, once you get past this muddy section, you are going to start climbing up South Kingsman Mountain. This section right here, this climb, is a very challenging climb. This will be a climb unlike anything else that you have done so far to this point. There are going to be sections of this climb that you're probably going to have to put away your trekking poles because of the boulders that you have to climb over and maneuver around. This is kind of where the trail stops becoming more of a trail and more of just a boulder field. And Kingsman does a great job with welcoming you to the White Mountains. Now, some folks told me after Kingsman that they thought Kingsman was one of the most difficult climbs in the White Mountains. I'll leave that to you to make that choice, but I would definitely say it probably was somewhere in my top 3. Now, once you get up and over Kingsman, you're going to come to Kingsman Pond Shelter. This is your first shelter in the White Mountains if you're heading northbound that you're actually going to have to pay to stay at the shelter. All the shelters are maintained by AMC as well, and they have a caretaker at each and every site. And the fee to stay at this shelter is $10 per person. So you're going to want to make sure that you have cash on you so that you can pay for your stays at the shelters during the course of the White Mountains. Now, just 2 miles past Kingsman Pond Shelter, you are going to reach your first hut in the White Mountains, which is called Lonesome Lake Hut. Now, how the AMC huts work if you want to stay there. You can either A, make a reservation far in advance, but you're going to pay a pretty penny. The cost of stay at the huts are somewhere between $100 to $200, I believe, depending on the day of the week that you stay there and the time of the year. The other option is a work for stay. Now, everyone that does pay to stay there, basically what they're paying for is A, a bunk at the hut itself, and B, they're paying to get fed both at dinner and then at breakfast. Now, the other option is doing a work for stay. If you want to do a work for stay, you're going to come into the hut and you're going to ask the lead member of that hut if they have any open positions for work for stay that night. Now, don't bother asking unless if it's at least around 4 or 5 p.m., unless if there's really bad weather and you need to get out of the elements. Now, if they allow you to stay, then what you're going to do for work is one of 2 different things. You're either going to do chores after dinner or after breakfast the next morning. It kind of depends on, again, how many people are staying there, how many people have work for stays, and who agrees to do what. The kind of chores that you're going to be doing there are really simple. They could be wiping down cabinets, doing dishes, or sweeping the dining hall. It's really easy stuff, and usually it doesn't take more than 20 or 30 minutes. Now, the cool part about a work for stay is after everyone that paid to stay there gets done eating, then the staff eats, and then you get anything that is left over. Typically, there's quite a bit of food, so it's kind of nice being able to eat some really good hot food up in the mountains, the White Mountains nonetheless, during that time. Now, if you don't want to stay at the huts, you can pass through there and use the bathroom in the inside, or every single day during the course of the day, they actually have bakery goods and lemonade that you can actually purchase from the AMC there, and they could just be like bars or muffins, Rice Krispie bars, things like that, cookies maybe. And anyway, but you can come in for a bakery good and some lemonade. Typically, I always got at least one bakery good and a lemonade every single time I passed a hut in the Whites. Now, the next major hurdle going northbound is climbing up Franconia Ridge. You have quite a climb to get up to Franconia Ridge, but once you're up there, this is going to be your first major section of the trail that you're going to be above tree line. This part is really important that you are paying attention to the weather, and this is where the danger can come in here. You want to make sure that you are not caught up above tree line during any high winds and lightning especially. So it's really important that you are checking the weather. Now, every single hut that you pass is actually going to have the weather forecast for every single section of the White Mountains, basically where each hut is, which covers the course of the entire 100-mile stretch of the Whites there. So if you're not interested in buying the bakery goods or doing a work for stay or even need to use the restroom, at least stop in there and check out the forecast. Those get updated regularly just because of the safety aspect. Now, as you ascend through Franconia Ridge up to Mount Lafayette, you're going to hit your next hut. This hut is actually not on the trail itself. You got to descend about 1,000 feet from Mount Lafayette. The name of this hut is called Greenleaf Hut. Most people that are going there are folks that are actually staying there, unless if you're in some sort of situation where there's some bad weather. But most thru-hikers aren't going to go down to Greenleaf just because of it being off trail and having to descend 1,000 feet to get there. Now, after Franconia Ridge, your next mountain that you're going to hit is called Mount Garfield. Don't underestimate Mount Garfield. The climb is pretty steep, And this was an area of the trail that I heard about a couple of thru hikers actually slipping and falling and hurting themselves. Going up and over Mount Garfield, there's a brief section of the trail where you're actually hiking up what looks like a waterfall. So there's literally almost like this small creek that's running through the rocks that you're climbing up to the top of Mount Garfield. Because of that, this makes it really slippery and pretty dangerous. So make sure that you're careful when you're climbing up and over Mount Garfield, not to mention it is steep as well. Now, before you hit South Twin Mountain, you have your third hut in the White Mountains, which is called Galehead Hut. This was the first hut that I actually stayed at that I did a work for stay, and it worked out really good because I actually was about to hit some pretty bad weather, and I just so happened to get out and get there for the last work for stay. Now, past Galehead Hut, you're going to ascend 1,200 feet in 0.8 of a mile. This is another steep climb, which becomes pretty regular out here in the White Mountains. Once you get to the top of Twin Mountain, though, you're going to have another fantastic view. I remember there being a stealth campsite just on the northern side of South Twin Mountain, maybe half a mile or less down the trail. So if you're in a pinch and you need to set up a shelter, there is an option right up in that area. Now, past South Twin Mountain, the next 14 miles as you descend down to Crawford Notch is probably one of the easiest stretches of the White Mountains. Once you make it to Crawford Notch, the fun really begins. You are going to hit probably the most popular section of the trail, which is the Presidential Range. You'll have a steep ascent coming on Crawford Notch, and 6 miles past Crawford Notch, you'll hit Mitzpah Hut. Now, the key thing to know here about Mitzpah Hut is the last place that you can stay in the Presidential Range heading northbound that's below tree line. Unless you have reservations to stay at Lake of the Clouds Hut, I strongly recommend that you stay at Mitzpah Hut or the shelter that's at Mitzpah Hut until the following day to start nice and early to get over Mount Washington. Now, the tent site that is located at Mitzpah Hut is also going to cost you $10. So if you can't do a work for stay, you're going to have to pay the $10 to stay at the tent site. Now, coming out of Mitzpah Hut, you're going to hike about 5 miles up to Lake of the Clouds Hut. Now, you only gain about 1,200 feet of elevation in those 5 miles, so it's not too bad. But something to know about this area, Lake of the Clouds Hut is the last hut before you start your ascent up Mount Washington. This is the area that is home of some of the worst weather in America and has the highest wind speed ever recorded by man back in the early 1900s. So it's really important that you know the weather before you go past Lake of the Clouds Hut. Now, Lake of the Clouds Hut is the most popular hut and the biggest hut of all of them in the White Mountains. And they allow, if I recall right, somewhere around 6 to 8 thru hikers to do work for stays. Now, the other thing about Lake of the Clouds Hut is there is a room that's located below the hut that is called the dungeon, and honestly it looks like a dungeon, that they allow thru hikers to stay in, and they created this for anybody that is hiking off season and needs to get out of the elements because of bad weather. You actually have access to get into this dungeon even when the hut is closed. Now, you do have to pay to stay in this dungeon, and I think there's only about 4 bunks or something like that in the dungeon. But it's not going to be the nicest place that you stay at, but if there are no options for work for stay here, you do have that option to stay in the dungeon. Now, coming out of Lake of the Clouds Hut, you are going to see a sign that talks about the danger of hiking up to Mount Washington and about the deaths that have occurred every year, even in the summertime. Again, just to warn you. But you're going to climb about 1,300 feet up to Mount Washington. Now, if it's a normal day, you are not going to see almost anything the closer you get up to Mount Washington. There are going to be rock cairns everywhere, and the rock cairns are there to guide you because honestly, if they weren't, you would have no way of knowing where you're at and would be totally disoriented. Now, if you are really, really lucky and you get one of about 50 days a year where it's actually clear on top of Mount Washington, you really lucked out. Now, the AMC actually runs a train that takes tourists all the way from Gorham, New Hampshire, or somewhere around there, all the way up to Mount Washington. So when you get up there, there are literally hundreds of people, hundreds of tourists there. What's important about this is if you want to get a picture at the sign of Mount Washington, which pretty much every single thru hikers would want to have, you want to make sure that you leave nice and early out of either Mitzpah Hut or Lake of the Clouds so you can get up there at a decent time before all the tourists come up, or else you're going to be waiting in line for a very long time to get your picture taken at Mount Washington. Now, there is a visitor center there that has a museum that talks about the history of Mount Washington and a place to eat all kinds of different snacks. So it's a great chance just to get fueled up and relax a little bit before you start your descent down to Madison Hut. Now, once you start your descent down Mount Washington, you still have almost 8 miles above tree line. This is the section of the trail that is really, really strenuous because you are literally walking over complete sharp boulder fields of rocks for the entire 8-mile stretch. I remember asking myself the question, what does it even feel like to actually feel flat, level ground below my feet? This section is pretty difficult mentally and takes quite a toll on you. And again, it is really, really strenuous. I mean, there's literally like billions upon billions of rocks that you are navigating through, which also makes it pretty cumbersome, and you just can't move very fast during this section of the trail. Now you're going to get down to Madison Spring Hut, which is going to be your last hut before you hit Pinkham Notch. Now, if you don't have reservations and cannot do a work for stay at Madison Hut, you still have 2 miles to hike up and over Mount Madison, down to get below tree line again. All in all, this whole stretch of the Presidential Range between Mitzpah Hut and past Madison Mountain is about 12 or 13 miles above tree line. Now, once you get up Mount Madison, the descent down Mount Madison was probably the most brutal descent that I can recall of the White Mountains. Not only is it steep, but with all of the boulders and the sharp boulders that you have to navigate through, it just makes it very, very difficult because you are literally looking down the entire time. If you want to look up, you literally have to stop and balance yourself because you're basically balancing on all these sharp boulders. So make sure that you're very careful as you're descending down Mount Madison. Now, you'll get down to Pinkham Notch, and you have 2 different options here at Pinkham Notch to get to Gorham, New Hampshire. Gorham, New Hampshire is a big town, a great town to be able to resupply and do everything that a thru hiker needs to do. But you can either go to Gorham on the south side of Gorham through Pinkham Notch, or you can hike over the Wildcats and go to Gorham on the opposite northern side, which is at US 2. You can also get to Gorham, New Hampshire on that side of the Wildcats as well. Now, climbing out of Pinkham Notch, this is the absolute steepest section of the trail. You're climbing up Wildcat Mountain, and you're going to ascend just over 2,000 feet in about 1.4 or 1.5 miles. This section right here was really difficult. It's going to take you some time, and this is another section that you're literally going to have to put away your trekking poles because you're going to have to climb up and over some of the boulders and some of the rock faces. I'd much rather ascend this part than descend. The descent's going to be very steep and tricky, so southbounders, make sure you are very careful when you're descending down Wildcat Mountain. Now, once you get up and over Wildcat Mountain, you're going to hit the last hut in the White Mountains, which is called Crawford Notch Hut. And then past the hut, you're going to go and climb up Carter Dome, which is pretty much the last steep climb in the White Mountains section. Past Carter Dome, you're going to hike 14 more miles up and down parts of this Wildcat mountain range down to US 2. And there's a hostel called White Mountain Lodge and Hostel. Highly recommend this place. I ate some pizza and ice cream at this hostel. It was really, really clean, but it does book up very fast. So make sure you call in advance for reservations. The great thing that this hostel does is they offer slack packing options, and if there was a section of any part of the trail that you're going to want to slack pack, it's going to be up and over the Wildcat mountain range. And the reason why this slack packing option is really attractive is just because how steep that you're going to be going up Wildcat Mountain or if you're heading southbound, how steep of a descent that you're going to be going down, and it's just going to make it a lot easier on your body, and you'll be able to do the Wildcat section, that 21-mile section between Pinkham Notch and US 2 in one day. Well, that wraps up this 100-mile section of the Whites. Now, if you are thinking about heading southbound, the stretch of trail that you're going to see between the White Mountains and southern Maine is brutal. I mean brutal. It's strenuous, it's challenging, and it requires a skill set that northbounders acquire during the course of their first 1,800 miles that they trek from Georgia all the way up to New Hampshire. If you don't have a lot of skills with hiking and backpacking, especially in challenging and strenuous areas, I would caution you of thinking about heading southbound and maybe doing a flip-flop instead, or maybe just heading northbound. I heard about some stories of southbound hikers that got very hurt going through the White Mountains because they slipped and fell and hurt themselves because of the experience level that they had at that time. Now, I'm not saying that northbounders or anybody for that matter can't get hurt going through this section. Anybody can. But the more experience you have, the easier it's going to be. That wraps it up. If there's anything that I might have missed, or if there's anything those of you that have hiked this section want to add in, please do so in the comments below. This was by far my most favorite section of the Appalachian Trail. Stay tuned for my next sighting, and remember to always follow Bigfoot.